got to walk that lonesome valley. You got to walk it by yourself. There's no...
Shannon is asked to remember and write down the 4 fruits depicted in the paintings behind her. She writes an orange, a strawberry, and a guava. The faceless voices reviewing the surveillance footage discuss this. Did she get 2 right, or 3? It's not a guava, it's a pear, but they already know it's a pear. Did she misremember, or did she simply interpret the watercolour painting differently from how they did? Did her different background, any number of cultural, social, or even personal experiences lead her to believe that the crude watercolour was a guava, and if so, is her answer wrong? In the first episode of the 1972 series of video essays Ways of Seeing, John Berger discusses how modern methods of transmitting images changes their context, and in doing so changes their meaning to the audience. He demonstrates how isolating part of the image, displaying the entire image with lower detail, applying music or any number of other modifications can alter the way the audience interacts with the work. Context is a lot more than simply when, where, and how someone saw the image, though. The context in which someone views a work of art is ultimately the sum total of all experiences that person has had leading up to that moment. The fact that this context varies greatly from person to person makes it a minor miracle that we can ever find consensus on the meanings of a work at all. We've all led different lives, we've all had different experiences, and so when each of us views a work of art, we do so with different contexts. Changing the context changes the meaning. For this reason, I can't tell you what Kentucky Route Zero means. I can tell you what it meant to me, how it made me feel, what it reminded me of. I can take a guess at what the collective authorship of the people working at Cardboard Computer intended it to mean, though no matter how much research I do, both from interviews and from reading related works, I can only ever guess. I certainly can't say what Kentucky Route Zero will mean to you. I don't know you, I don't have that power, and I certainly don't have that right. Only you can say for certain what, if anything, an artistic work means to you. For that reason, I would encourage you to play the game for yourself before returning to this video. I would encourage you to experience it unburdened by my opinions, my interpretations, to experience it without my influence. If not, do not take my words as truth, as an explicit declaration of meaning, intended or otherwise. Simply view it as more context. The truth is, you may not even witness the tests at the Radvansky Center that led Shannon to those paintings. Kentucky Route Zero is strictly linear in a traditional fashion. Everyone starts in the same place, everyone will end up in the same place, but the journey will differ for everyone. More often than not, these differences are subtle. Certain scenes may or may not be present in your journey due to your choices, whether they're switched to an alternative scene or are entirely optional secrets. The differences are most obvious in Act 4, however, a long, winding boat ride down the Echo River. You roll down the river on a tugboat, with each stop representing a choice to stay aboard or go ashore. These choices are usually less obvious, relegated to where you go next on the map, be that of Kentucky or the Zero. The other choices are dialogue. Dialogue choices are a common element in a lot of games, but Kentucky Route Zero uses them more poetically than most. They rarely have any major effect on the way the narrative plays out, but the game is careful to ensure one of your earliest choices is an impactful one. What's the name of Conway's old dog? By giving the player such an obvious choice, with such an obvious effect, it primes the player to view any possible line of dialogue as impactful in a mechanical sense, prompting them to pay closer attention throughout. While most dialogue options won't have a mechanical impact, however, they're still used to great effect for narrative impact. Dialogue branches can't be returned to later, and while they might loop back on themselves or arrive at the same conclusion, a branch not taken is lost for that playthrough. Care seems to have been taken then to give the options presented to the player impact themselves, not just the results of those options. As much subtle exposition and thematic weight is presented through the choices themselves as it is in the dialogue they lead to. Hints and details of a backstory are present in the list presented to the player, so you still get information and characterization from the choices you reject. The result is that each dialogue option presents the player not an opportunity to shape the narrative to their choosing, but an opportunity to select a path that is most resonant with them. This is most apparent within the constant use of dialogue triptychs. It's not uncommon for the player to be given subsequent dialogue options, often in threes, without any interstitial responses. Whether that's entering a long password in the computer at Equus Oils, or talking to your dog, these dialogues affect nothing but the player's connection to the work, presenting them with a sequence of choices that only ask the player to seriously consider the events before them, and which responses speak to them the most. When the choices are part of an actual conversation, there's often thematic continuity between sets of options. The same idea is presented in different ways repeatedly. Not always, but often the choices will boil down to a pair of options, which repeat an approach to how you engage with the world, to look to the future or the past, to reveal something about yourself or inquire deeper about your conversation partner. These kinds of duos present themselves throughout. Other times the choice isn't so much what is said, but who is saying it. You take control of several characters throughout the game, and often dialogue will involve more than one of them. This again presents an opportunity to develop theme and character before the player even makes a selection. Even if the player chooses another character to speak, you still learn something about those who didn't from what they could have said, what they would have said in that situation. There's a large cast of characters, both who travel with you and who you'll meet along the way, but you start with just one, Conway. Conway's journey starts when he stops at Equus Oils for directions. Or to be more precise, his journey with the player starts there. His own started long before. Like every character, he has a lot of backstory to be teased out throughout the game. He's been through a lot, he's an ex-alcoholic, has worked various odd jobs over the years trying to keep afloat, and for now he's working as a delivery driver for his friend Lisette's antique store. There's a Robert Frost poem the game references if you dig deep enough to find it, The Death of the Hired Man. In it, an old man, Silas, arrives at a farm looking for work. He's worked there before, but was unreliable and has fallen in and out of employment. The farmer's wife, Mary, urges her husband Warren to hire him back one last time, or at least talk to him, make him feel welcome. When Warren enters the house, Silas has died, along with his plans. Conway is Silas in many ways. Lisette seems to have hired him more out of pity than out of the fact he does a good job, and it's implied that when working for her now dead husband Ira at his roofing business, Conway's drunkenness led him to missing a job on which their son subsequently died in an accident. It seems Ira blamed Conway for this, but if Lisette did, it never shows. So now Conway drives Ira's old truck, accompanied by Ira's old dog, for one last delivery. The final delivery of Lisette's antique shop is to number 5 Dogwood Drive, and it's going to take the entire game to find your way there. During that journey you'll both drive and walk. Kentucky Route Zero is a rather slow game in a moment-to-moment sense. This is a common criticism levied against it by detractors. A lot of the game plays like a traditional point-and-click adventure game, but the areas you'll be pointing and clicking your way around are far larger than is common in the genre. It can take a long time to get places, with both your character and the camera often taking far longer to traverse the spaces that would normally be expected. I'd argue that looking at a game this way is a mistake though. Deep in the mines, early in the game you find a stage. It was left over from a pair of archivists who were studying local miners' songs. When discussing what the archivists were looking for in the songs, it's assumed to be some esoteric aspect, intonation, diction, subject matter, all those little details that no one really thinks about when they listen to music. It seems they were examining the technical aspects of the music from a disconnected, academic perspective. I find a lot of modern artistic criticism of popular culture, especially regarding games, falls into this trap. So much of modern discourse surrounds the technical components of a work, seemingly to try and prove whether or not it is objectively good. Like it's more important to prove that somehow you hold the correct opinion, that you like the right games, and that you can back that up with evidence. an attempt to prove you are objective instead of actually discussing your experience with the work. Objectivity within media criticism is of course a lie. You can spend all the time in the world recording how plants interact with the player in God of War, or nitpicking how the specific design choices of guns in Starfield don't align with real-world weapons manufacturing, but this won't tell you what it's like to play those games. It won't convey the emotional experience, or what that experience might mean to someone. That's not to say these examinations of technical elements lacks any value. While everyone's experience of a work lay within different contexts, there are commonalities between people, especially within cultures, and certain ideas, symbols, or in the case of games, mechanics, that are likely to elicit a similar response. Understanding that can help creatives to better consider how a work may be received, but even if everyone receives a work identically, that still represents collective subjectivity, not objectivity. Despite the disconnected nature of their examination, however, archival work is valuable. The miners are all gone now, and the tapes the archivists recorded may be all that's left of the songs. What they might have meant to the miners, how it might have felt to listen to them sing, may have been lost, but if the songs have been saved, then they may at least mean something again, to someone, someday. There is no objectively correct speed for the characters to move in Kentucky Route Zero, only how the individual experiences it. For some who don't find that much in the writing or art of the world to connect with, I can see the pace of movement would be frustrating. For me, I found it engaging. It granted time to take in the beautiful visuals like the world is made of folded paper, time to consider the connections between characters and places, time to consider the emotional impact each scene was having. For me, a faster pace of movement would have detracted from that. The mines are one of Conway's earliest stops on the path to Dogwood Drive, and it's there that two important things happen. The first is meeting Shannon. She runs her own TV repair business, but times are hard and it looks like she's going to have to close her workshop above the local bait store. Why she's in the mines is unclear at first, but given the unusual circumstances that brought Conway there, it's not all that suspicious. Shannon quickly grows into the role of secondary protagonist. She's as troubled as Conway in her own way, but comes to be a very welcome travelling companion. She's intelligent and straightforward, but also caring and quickly grows close to Conway, and as Conway falters, she remains steadfast. Her dialogues tend to be much more direct than Conway's more tangential approach. The mines are also where Conway picks up his first physical injury, to go along with a lifetime of emotional ones. A collapse forces the two of them to find an alternative exit, but it also injures Conway's leg. It slows his movement speed for the rest of the game and adds finding medical help as an important secondary goal, in addition to finishing the delivery. Doing either will require a great deal of driving, both above ground and below. The driving mechanics make up the other part of much of the game, though the term driving is perhaps a little overindulgent. Navigating the overworld is simple enough, a slice of Kentucky, specifically the Route 65 around Mammoth Cave National Park. The roads themselves are more or less one-to-one with the real highways of Kentucky, but I doubt the ever-burning tree is among Kentucky's real-world roadside attractions. The combination of real road networks and fictionalized landmarks makes for a surreal, almost dreamlike quality to the world. The game's marketing uses the phrase magical realism, a phrase which gets some flack for being seen as a juxtaposition, but only if viewed from a gamer's perspective. From an artistic perspective, it's bang on. While in gaming spaces, and pop cultural spaces in general, to be fair, realism often refers to either a visual quality of being true to life, or a thematic quality of, if not true to life elements, at least a sense of internal logic that feels real. In an artistic sense, however, the realism movement of the 19th century was a direct response to Romanticism. One of the major components that set it apart from previous artistic movements was not the accuracy of its visual depictions, though that was a factor, but on the choice of subject matter itself. It was far more focused on truthful depictions, not of stories, history, or the upper classes, but of all social classes, examining the lives of common people and the effects of the changes to society, positive and often negative, brought about by the industrial and economic revolutions. Kentucky Route Zero's examination of grief, debt, and the effects of deindustrialization on rural American communities, without shying away from or idealizing those changes, place it firmly within the context of a work of realism. The magic, however, comes from the Zero. The game's surreal and dreamlike qualities are most exemplified in the Zero itself. The Zero is a series of underground highways stretching throughout the area, but navigating them is far more confusing a process than on the surface. The road spirals and loops on itself. It's presented as a single continuous circle, but the locations you pass change as you drive, and change depending on which way you're driving. Directions are written down for you as on the surface, but it's no longer a case of taking the 65 northeast until you pass the prosthetic limb factory, then taking the next right. Now, directions are more like unlocking a safe. Clockwise to the feather, then anti-clockwise to the talon. After that, turn around and you'll reach your destination, eventually. Finding your way around is difficult, and getting lost is trivial. It is, in theory, possible to map out the Zero. It follows a set of rules, and those rules are possible to be drawn up, but I've looked at maps of the Zero, and they aren't much easier to navigate than the road itself. Despite how confusing the Zero is, however, people still live and work within it. They aren't any stranger than the people who live and work above ground, either. No matter their circumstances, people are people. Their lives may be different, but their struggles are often the same. Unsatisfying jobs, money troubles, debt, grief and regrets. Beyond Conway, Shannon and Ira's old dog, you'll pick up a small cadre of other companions along the way, like Ezra, the orphan with a giant eagle for a brother who lives in the Museum of Dwellings, a museum holding various types of homes for both man and animal, or Junebug and Johnny, a pair of travelling musicians who may or may not be robots. Each adds something to the party dynamic with their input, whether that's Ezra's childlike curiosity and wonder, or Junebug's carefree positivity. The result is a strong group of characters, with a variety of outlooks on the events transpiring. Music plays a big part of Kentucky Route Zero. Most commonly it's used as an overt background element. At various points a band will appear, silhouetted in the foreground at poignant moments as they play, but there are also more explicitly diegetic moments. They're all effective in their own way, like watching Clara perform from the tugboat in Act 4 as Junebug and Johnny reminisce about the night they first watched her play, but the most memorable by far is Junebug and Johnny's own performance in the lower depths. A bar where the patrons are gone and the only people in the building are the bartender and your group. The duo still play their one-song set, but it's not the transformation that they take on as they play that makes it memorable, or the way the roof melts away to reveal the stars wheeling above. The key to the sequence is that it plays out as one of the dialogue triptychs I mentioned earlier. Rather than simply sitting and watching the performance, which would have been a good time on its own, you're prompted for the first line of each verse, and the song grows from each. The game constructs the song from the concepts you find most resonant when presented with them, then it finishes, and you move on. The segment doesn't outstay its welcome, and acts well enough on its own to be memorable, while at the same time connecting with the other sequences and building themes, such as with the fate of the missing patrons. Much of the game has this feeling of being made up of separate vignettes, but at the same time each being connected thematically and narratively to one another in ways that build and add texture over the course of the game. The 5 acts that make up the game are themselves connected by the interludes. Kentucky Route Zero took a long time to actually release. Its initial Kickstarter was funded in 2011, with the first act available in 2013, but it would be 7 more years before the final act would be released and the game would be complete. Naturally, this has something of an effect on the game. Anyone who has worked on any long-term creative project will tell you that your relationship with the work changes as you produce it, and this shows up in the form of the shifting focus of the themes the game is interested in as the act goes on. Slightly cushioning the gradual drip release of the game, the interludes act as tangential yet connective tissue being released between major acts. Conway, Shannon and the gang don't appear. Many of the interludes focus on a trio of characters who only appear intermittently in the main game. Emily, Bob, and Ben are actually met in the first moments of the first act, but their presence in the main game is slight up until its conclusion. They appear more frequently in the interludes, which tend to focus on smaller, more experimental sequences, but no less important from an experiential standpoint. You'll wander an art gallery of early works by a character you'll meet later in the game, each exhibit somehow narratively or thematically linked to the events there, or you'll be presented with a play where you are both audience and participant, and the play is both fictional and the events in the lower depths before you arrived. They usually exist to set up elements and themes that won't pay off till later, however, which can lead to them feeling disconnected at first, until their relevance starts to come clear later. I've heard some people say they're pointless, which I have to firmly disagree with, but I understand that if your main focus is on Conway and his journey, then the interludes are unlikely to help you understand him or the events of his travels. Without them, however, you won't have as clear an idea of the background of three other major characters in the game: Lula, Joseph, and Donald. The three are old friends. They work together on several projects before drifting apart. Despite their appearances being only brief, the writing does a good job of fleshing out not so much a backstory, but a sense of a backstory. They feel like people with a history, both individually and as a group, even though you only ever get brief snippets of that history. They've separated now and each gone their own way. Joseph runs the gas station at the start of the game. He's the one who directs Conway to seek the Zero in order to reach Dogwood Drive. Lula used to be an experimental artist. It's a gallery of her work you explore as Emily and her friends in the first interlude, but she's since had to abandon her artistic pursuits and find more stable employment. She works at the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces, a central location on the Zero that attempts to keep track of where everything is. She helps Conway and Shannon track down the location of Dogwood Drive and directs them to a doctor to help out with his leg. There's something quietly yet deeply tragic about Lula. She's a capable and creative person who's achieved so many things before you meet her. She played in a band in college where she first met Joseph and Donald, helped put on plays, exhibited artwork across the world, has pursued so many things, and now she works as an office clerk, shifting files around and struggling to help people through arcane bureaucracy. She isn't shown to be particularly unhappy, she gets along with her colleagues, but she seems deeply unsatisfied. She holds onto the notes from people who remember her creative days, still seems to wish to pursue that kind of work, but she can't do so and remain stable. Many of the characters in the game are struggling to make ends meet. Conway and his odd jobs, Shannon and Lisette's businesses closing, entire towns above ground swallowed up and spat out by local industries that have moved on. Lula is doing better than most, with a stable job and a stable income, but she doesn't seem to be any better for it. Still struggling, since despite her stability, that's all she really is now. It's a harrowing truth of the modern age. Even when you find stability, it often takes so much of yourself to maintain that you can't meaningfully pursue anything more than that. The three friends never seem to struggle with regrets about their wasted youth, rather regrets that they can't continue to pursue such things in the present. Or at the very least, Lula and Joseph do. Donald still pursues his goals, and that's led him to living in a cave of burning computers. Kentucky has a strangely important place in the history of video games as a medium. Mammoth Cave National Park is named for its vast central cave network. Colossal Cavern was initially thought to be a separate network, though theories formed that it may be connected to the larger Mammoth Cave system in the early 1900s. In 1960, a connection was discovered to the Greater Mammoth system. In 1976, William Crowther would begin to develop the game Colossal Cave Adventure, later known more simply as Adventure. Inspired by his own experiences caving in the Mammoth Cave network, especially the bedquilt section of the caves near Colossal Cavern, Colossal Cave Adventure was the earliest example of the text-based adventure. Adventure would be further developed and expanded by Don Woods, and its distribution across ARPANET, a precursor to the internet, would make it one of the earliest big hits among video games. While often overlooked now, Adventure is a pivotal early work of the medium, going on to not only source the name of an entire genre, but act as a direct inspiration to Zork, which itself would inspire further works and further genres, eventually leading to the point-and-click adventures, which in turn would inspire Kentucky Route Zero. Adventure is memorialised within Kentucky Route Zero as Xanadu. Deep in the Bedquilt Cave system, in the Hall of the Mountain King, both real locations within the Mammoth Cave network, Donald still waits, gradually trying to perfect the game. Running on a rickety old system, barely functioning when you arrive, Xanadu is the life's work of Donald, the final work that Lula, Joseph and him collaborated on. It's implied to be an attempt to develop a completely accurate simulation of the local area and the events running up to its development, but it's presented as a short text adventure. That's only after you get it working though. Age hasn't been kind to Donald or his machine, and when you arrive it's barely functioning. You need to fix it, since Lula sent you there as your next stop on your path to finding Dogwood Drive. It's the only computer powerful enough to sort through the records to find its location, and the only people who may know how to fix it are the strangers at the nearby distillery. The Hard Times Distillery represents the end of Conway's path. It's the final time you control him, though he'll travel with you a little way further beyond it. People work there to pay off their debts. Everyone there is deeply in debt in some way or another. It's staffed by electric skeletons, but they seem perfectly normal people apart from that. Shannon can even degauss them to learn who they were before the debt swallowed them. You're given a brief tour of the distillery, the foreman being under the impression that Conway is there to start as a new delivery driver. The tour ends with a celebratory drink, a drink that takes control of Conway away from you, a very expensive drink that takes control of Conway away from himself. When the foreman realises Conway isn't there for a job, well, the drink has to be paid for, not to mention the tour. Trapped by this new debt, Conway has no other choice. He starts work in the morning. Conway is already in debt at this point anyway. He still needs to pay the bill to the doctor who treated his leg. His leg which, after treatment, takes on the form of a bone made of electricity, much like the skeletons at the distillery. As you mosey down the Echo River in Act 4, Conway starts to drink in earnest. Soon it's not just his leg, but also his arm that's changed. He starts talking to other distillery workers no one else can see. He slowly loses himself to the debt and the drink and the grief. And then he's gone. When making a stop to deliver a package, Shannon turns around to see Conway completely transformed as he travels down the river with another pair of skeletons to start his job at the distillery. The way Kentucky Route Zero treats its characters and its locations evokes the works of Southern Gothic writers such as William Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor. The American South has a problematic history, and something of a problematic present, but there's often a sense in the wider culture that its people are somehow different, aberrant, lesser even than the rest of the population. The tradition of Southern Gothic humanises people of the southern states without shying away from the troubles and divides caused by the area's past. While Kentucky Route Zero's treatment of its characters falls into that tradition, however, the thematic focus of debt and the way decisions of industry affect the lives of individuals are more reminiscent of Steinbeck. Combined with the surreal presentation, the entire game ends up with a feeling of being like The Grapes of Wrath if it was directed by David Lynch. To be in debt so long that it consumes you, until that work is your only purpose, until that survival becomes the only possibility and living falls out of reach, it eats away at a person in the same way it eats away at Conway. Conway may not literally die, but he's a ghost by the time Act 4 closes. The game is full of ghosts, some literal, but most in a metaphorical sense. The people who aren't around, the lives they could have led, the places that no longer serve their intended purpose. The entire county is haunted. With Conway gone, Shannon takes up the delivery in his stead. She inherits his truck, and his coat, and if he doesn't leave as well, his dog. Junebug, Johnny and Ezra stick around to finish the job as well. Conway's absence is palpable throughout the remainder of Act 4. No one really addresses it, but every scene has an empty chair, an empty place where Conway should have been. Of all the ghosts throughout the game, the most conspicuous by her absence is Weaver. Like the Zero, Weaver's involvement spreads throughout the game, connecting disparate characters and distant plots. She's connected in some way to almost every character in the game. She was Shannon's cousin. Her parents were the archivists recording the miners' songs. She worked with Lula at the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces, with Donald in the Hall of the Mountain King, at the distillery and at the same community station that Emily, Bob and Ben did. After she disappeared, she continued to hack into that station's network, transmitting a pirate broadcast. It was one of those broadcasts that sent Shannon to the mines when she first met Conway. The only time she appears in person, however, is at the old farm her family owned. There she directs Conway to the same place. For all her importance, however, very little is known about her. She's an enigmatic figure, and an unsatisfying mystery, though only if your satisfaction from mysteries come from their solving. Otherwise, she's something of a comforting leitmotif. A figure behind the scenes, connecting people in the same way the Zero and the Echo and the roads of Kentucky connect places. Uncovering these connections between characters and places can be one of the most engaging elements of the game. There are very complex webs of characters who connect with or echo one another. Emily, Bob and Ben, for example. Conway first meets them in the basement of Equus Oils, and again outside the Museum of Dwellings, but they never actually speak to one another. Outside of the interludes, their major appearance is in the final act. They're residents of Dogwood Drive, working together at the community television station, which by the time you reach it has been hit by a terrible storm. They're also echoes of Lula, Joseph and Donald, each a group of friends, each driven by creative endeavours, but we can only hope the future can be kinder to the younger group than it was to the old. Many elements of the game connect with themselves like this. Some of these connections are linear, like the Echo. Some crisscross and intercept one another, like the roads of Kentucky, and some loop and spiral cyclically, repeating themselves over and over, like the Zero. Uncovering and making these connections can be compelling and engaging, but ultimately whether or not you find your time in Kentucky Route Zero valuable relies on whether it resonates with you emotionally in some way. I don't think it's difficult for it to. The work is thematically dense and features a great many sequences. Despite the slow movement speed within each section, they move from one to another at quite a pace. Each act takes between 1 and 2 hours to play, and features several vignettes within them. If an individual sequence doesn't connect with you, it's not likely to be long before another comes along, with each acting both as a strong independent moment and connecting with the others to create something greater. I think this is one of the reasons Kentucky Route Zero is so well regarded. It's well presented and thoughtfully written, but it also covers so many themes and features, so many connections throughout, that many people who play it are likely to connect with at least some part of it. Maybe it's the theme of debt, or maybe grief, maybe the lost potential of artists trying to make a living, or maybe it's simply the camaraderie of the group as they travel. There's likely to be something that has an impact on the player as they make their journey from Equus Oils to Dogwood Drive. I've barely scratched the surface of what I found compelling within the work, the connections I felt were important, the themes I thought rang true. Hammering just these elements of the sprawling and dense web that makes up Kentucky Route Zero into a linear script was hard enough. To include everything that was worth talking about would have been impossible. I could talk even longer in rambling cyclical loops about the game, but those will have to remain unsaid. Everything has to end eventually. Kentucky Route Zero ends at Dogwood Drive, even if Conway isn't there to see it. A town is a lot like a person in some respects. It's an oddity when they die all at once, and no less a tragedy when it happens slowly. Bit by bit, over time, gradually losing pieces. Debt, illness, grief, the hardships pile up until they overwhelm, and then it's over. It's what happened to Conway, just as sure as it happened to Dogwood Drive. It died a little when the electric company took over and moved in. It died a little more when they left and the money left with them. It died a little more over and over as the people moved away, and finally with one last heave the storm took the last of the town with it. There are dead and dying towns all over the world, for one reason or another. The US isn't unusual for their presence, only in the way they're overrepresented given the relative length of its history. The nation's mythology of pioneership lending a certain romanticism to the towns that didn't survive. When you reach Dogwood Drive in Act 5, you aren't playing any of the characters anymore. You wander around as a cat, watching the memories of the ghosts who aren't there anymore, listening to the conversations of the ghosts trying to tidy the place up. There's a slight mechanical shift to distance you further from the events of the day. What dialogue there is gets split between listening to conversations going on, remembering events where you select choices from within the text, and the conversations where you play both sides. Like all art, the developers of Kentucky Route Zero may have intentions as to what is communicated with you, but ultimately in experiencing the work, you're only talking to yourself. You reflect ideas and interpret those reflections based on your own experiences. The conversations where you are both parties, question and answer, call and response, are often the strangest in the game. They're far more likely to end up talking past one another. This disconnection feels intentional. The game's constant use of the triptychs I described earlier were always far more coherent, far more likely to create something that felt meaningful. It seems unlikely that the developers suddenly forgot how to write like that in the final moments. The people are drifting away from one another. Those who are left, who joined the journey along the route, are now taking their leave of it and going their separate ways. It's an anticlimactic ending, with no answers to find and no threads tied up. That's what makes it satisfying in a way. Like Conway and the town, it doesn't end clearly and distinctively. It just fades away, leaving the memories to haunt you. As the remaining townsfolk try to save what they can from the storm of the night before, your group finishes Conway's delivery to number 5 Dogwood Drive without him. There's a funeral at the end. A pair of local horses died in the storm. They didn't have names, it wasn't anyone's place to give them names, but folks called them the neighbours. Horses have been in the area since before people were, and these were the last two. They were present at the farm where Conway first met Weaver, now they're present at the end. The horses are buried, along with the town, and the people all go their separate ways. Some to travel on, some to stay and try to rebuild. But the delivery is done. The town as it was is dead, and Kentucky Route Zero is over. You've finished travelling the Zero, but if the journey meant something, then the Zero will keep travelling with you until your own journey is complete. Thanks for watching.